September 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first A-bomb. America's monopoly on atomic weapons ended after only 4 years. Now, both superpowers had the means to destroy the world.
The next step was to stage a phony arms race and Cold War between their First World capitalist bloc and Second World communist bloc. Like sports teams, the U.S. and Russian superpowers needed recruits for their war games, so they forced new Third World members of the United Nations to choose sides. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles warned Third World countries that you're either with us or you're against us. Korea and Vietnam were torn up like rags into half-communist, half-capitalist countries and became the playing field for phony war games between the bankster superpowers.
Marilyn Monroe in Korea, America's great sex symbol, innocent and alluring, caught in the blood and mud of the Korean War. To the battle-weary soldiers who gazed at her, she must have looked like an angel sent from heaven to ease the pain of fighting a God-forsaken war in a far-off land.
It's difficult and dangerous. But though generally outnumbered, American Sabres and British Meteors are outfighting the MiGs.
The lives of 4 million Korean civilians and 33,000 American soldiers were sacrificed in the 1950 Korean War, bringing the banksters another step closer to world domination. Like Korea, Vietnam was split into North and South Vietnam and became their next target.
Take control! I've got control!
In 1954, the U.S. military dropped millions of tons of bombs on undefended Vietnamese civilians and turned their lush green countryside into blood-red killing fields. It was a butcherous campaign of terror, rape, torture, lies, and cover-ups. The U.S. military, who had already tested 2 radioactive atomic weapons of mass destruction on the people of Japan, decided to test their chemical weapons of mass destruction on the people of Vietnam. $70 million liters of chemical weapons of mass destruction were sprayed over the Vietnamese people, their water, and their countryside. The most lethal was Agent Orange, which defoliated, killed, and contaminated everything in its path like a radioactive atomic bomb. To this day, survivors suffer related cancers, genetic deformities, and permanent environmental damage. Many U.S. servicemen publicly confessed to their crimes and suffered haunting flashbacks.
Novel from New York, I have Vietnamese campaign ribbon, Vietnamese service ribbon, National Defense ribbon, and Purple Heart.
In spite of massive U.S. war protests, President Nixon increased America's military presence in Vietnam to 500,000 soldiers by 1969. It was Nobel Peace Prize winner Henry Kissinger who convinced Nixon to expand the Vietnam War to the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos, causing the mass murder of another 1 million innocent people and their families. On May 4th, 1970, America got a wake-up call. 6 peaceful anti-war student demonstrators from Kent State and Jackson State universities were shot dead by U.S. armed guards, while dozens of others were wounded. The message came through loud and clear. The power of the U.S. military could turn its weapons on its own citizens. In 1947, the United States played host to an international conference at Bretton Woods to put an end to world poverty and starvation caused by World War II. The idea was to give humanitarian loans to needy nations by creating a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund. But who would be put in charge of these billion-dollar megaloans? Who else but the U.S. Federal Reserve bankster families? Putting the U.S. Federal Reserve banksters in charge of humanitarian loans is like putting pedophiles in charge of daycare centers. Instead of helping the poor, the banksters turned the World Bank and International Monetary Fund into international pawn shops and robbed the poor. Just to qualify for a loan, desperate nations were forced to pawn their mines, forests, railways, power companies, and water systems and agree to over 100 loan conditions at loan shark interest rates. To pay off the loans, they were forced to ignore laws that protected their environment, to lower wages, and to cut back on their education and on their health care. They were also forced to privatize and sell off their resources to crooked corporations like Enron. Lord Wakeham, the director of N.M. Rothschild & Sons, was on the audit committee of Enron and cooked the books and sucked billions from pension funds and investors before declaring bankruptcy. When poor nations were unable to pay their loans, they were given new loans to pay off the old loans. But these so-called bailout loans weren't about bailing out the poor. They were about bailing out and lining the pockets of loan underwriters like Citigroup and America's most notorious crooks and banksters. As desperately poor nations got more desperately poor, the filthy rich banksters got filthier rich, and God help anybody who got in their way. Davison Buddu, senior economist for the International Monetary Fund, resigned to, quote, wash my hands of the blood of millions of poor and starving people. When President John F. Kennedy tried to take back America by reviving U.S. government printed money, his head was blown off in a Dallas motorcade. When his son planned to expose the ugly truth about his father's assassination, his small plane plunged into the ocean, killing all on board.